What if Joan of Arc had lived? The flames roar higher, smoke twists into the sky over Rouen, blotting out the sun. A 19-year-old girl in rough soldier's garb is bound to the stake. She closes her eyes, lips moving in prayer, while English soldiers shout and jeer. The crowd is restless, some weeping, some triumphant. The executioner sets the torch. History tells us that Joan of Arc died here, in 1431, burned alive as a heretic, silenced before her 20th birthday. But what if the flames had not claimed her? What if Joan had lived? How might France, England, and all of Europe have been transformed by the survival of a single peasant girl who defied kings and crowns? The year is 1415. On a field near Agincourt, mud clings to the boots of exhausted French knights as they charge once more into a storm of English arrows. The air is filled with the shriek of bowstrings and the dull thud of arrows piercing armor. Horses stumble, men fall, and the flower of French chivalry drowns in blood and mire. The English, led by Henry V, win a crushing victory, and the legend of their invincibility is sealed. From that moment onward, France is a kingdom not merely threatened, but humiliated. For decades, the 100 Years' War had already ravaged both kingdoms. It was not one single conflict, but a chain of brutal wars, truces, betrayals, and renewed campaigns. The roots lay deep in dynastic rivalry. The kings of England, descended from Norman conquerors, still clung to claims upon the crown of France. The kings of France, in turn, refused to yield their sovereignty. It was a war not just for land, but for legitimacy itself, a struggle over who had the right to rule the heart of Western Europe. By the 15th century, this long war had become something darker than a contest between nobles. It was a scourge upon the common people. Raiding armies torched villages, fields were abandoned, and hunger followed in their wake. Mercenaries, discharged when truces were signed, became roaming bands of brigands who looted with impunity. Entire regions of France fell into despair, with peasants crushed between rival lords and foreign invaders. Worse still, France itself was divided. The kingdom was torn apart by a civil war between two great factions, the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians, who turned against him and allied with the English. Paris, the very heart of France, fell under English control with the support of Burgundy. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes sealed France's humiliation, declaring that after King Charles VI's death, the crown of France would pass not to his son, the Dauphin, but to the infant Henry VI of England. France's future, it seemed, would be ruled from London. This treaty was more than political surrender. It was spiritual devastation. For centuries, the French monarchy had claimed its authority as sacred, anointed in the great cathedral of Reims with holy oil said to date back to Clovis himself. Now that sacred chain was broken, and the French people faced a world where their king was declared illegitimate, a shadow prince with no throne. The consequences were catastrophic. Entire provinces, including Normandy and much of northern France, lay firmly in English hands. The Burgundians controlled large swaths of territory as well, leaving the Dauphin with only a fractured southern base of support. From Toulouse to Bourges, loyalty to the crown was uncertain. In many towns, the people no longer knew which monarch to obey, an English infant crowned in Westminster, or a disinherited French prince wandering the Loire Valley. Into this chaos came famine, disease, and despair. The Black Death had struck only decades earlier, killing millions and leaving deep scars on Europe's psyche. Its shadow still lingered. For the peasants of France, the war was not a noble cause, but an endless cycle of suffering. Crops failed, homes were abandoned, and superstition grew. Many believed God had cursed their land. Some whispered that the apocalypse itself was near. And yet, despite all this, the English victory was not inevitable. England, too, faced limits. Its kings could win battles, but they could not easily govern lands across the Channel, especially when their realm at home was plagued by political faction and fragile finances. But in the early 15th century, all signs seemed to point in their favor. They had won crushing victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. They had seized Paris and secured the treaty that disinherited the Dauphin. They seemed poised to finish what their forefathers had begun. The conquest of France itself. The fate of Europe balanced on a knife's edge. If England triumphed fully, the very map of the continent would be redrawn. France would cease to exist as an independent power, absorbed into an Anglo-French empire. The wars of the future, the struggles of Spain, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, even the voyages across the Atlantic, would unfold in a different world. But none of this was yet certain, for in the shadows of despair, in villages where peasants prayed for deliverance, whispers began to grow, whispers that salvation would come not from kings or dukes, but from an unexpected source. History's storm was gathering, and soon, a figure unlike any other would step into the light of destiny. The year is 1428. Northern France bleeds under foreign rule. The English occupy Normandy and much of the north. The Burgundians hold Paris, and the Dauphin's cause withers in exile at Bourges. In taverns and marketplaces, peasants whisper that the kingdom itself has been abandoned by God. Priests struggle to reassure their flocks, but despair gnaws at every corner of the land. France, once proud, now seems only a carcass divided by vultures. The siege of Orléans begins in October. The English, determined to sever the last artery of French resistance, encircle the city with a ring of fortresses, towers, and stockades. To control Orléans is to control the Loire River, the lifeline into the heart of Charles' remaining territory. If Orléans falls, the path south opens wide, and the Dauphin may lose his final chance at legitimacy. Inside the walls, panic festers. Food dwindles. Citizens mutter about surrender. Outside, English cannons thunder day after day, tearing at the defenses. The garrison fights with grim resolve, but they know the odds. They are cut off, surrounded, and without aid, their fate is sealed. Orléans becomes not only a battlefield, but a symbol. To its defenders, survival means hope for France. To its besiegers, conquest promises the death of a nation. Far away in Bourges, the Dauphin Charles drifts in hesitation. He is called king by some, yet he wears no crown. His enemies mock him as the King of Bourges, a pitiful shadow of monarchy. Surrounded by cautious advisers and self-serving nobles, he fears betrayal as much as defeat. For years, he has done little but wait, hoping that time or diplomacy might save him. But now, with Orléans under siege, even he cannot ignore the truth. Without intervention, his cause will collapse. The court is divided. Some urge negotiation with the English. Others insist on raising a relief army, though their coffers are empty and their soldiers weary. The nobility grumble, unwilling to risk their fortunes for a king who inspires little confidence. Mercenaries can be hired, but mercenaries fight for coin, not for crowns. Each passing month draws the noose tighter, and the Dauphin's legitimacy fades with the city's crumbling walls. The English, meanwhile, sense victory at hand. Their commanders believe Orléans is the keystone of conquest. Once it falls, the south will lie open, and the Dauphin will be forced into permanent exile, or worse, submission. Already, their heralds speak confidently of triumph. Chroniclers record prophecies of France's extinction, predicting that the fleur-de-lis will vanish from banners forever. The people, however, refuse to let go of hope so easily. Across the countryside, peasants whisper of visions, of saints promising deliverance. Superstition grips villages that have long suffered war and famine. They believe that only a miracle can save them. Mothers pray at roadside shrines. Fathers teach their children that France will rise again. The yearning for salvation spreads like wildfire, uniting rich and poor in desperate faith. And within this crucible of fear and longing, rumors begin to circulate of a young woman from Domremy, a girl who claims to hear voices, who insists that God has chosen her to drive the English from France. To most, such tales sound like madness. To others, they sound like prophecy fulfilled. For now, she is only a whisper, a name passed from lip to lip. Yet soon, her presence will ignite like a torch in the darkness, reshaping the course of the war. The siege of Orleans, meant to be the English crown's final triumph, is about to become the stage for a miracle or a myth. But at this moment, in late 1428, no one knows the storm that is about to break. The cannons still thunder outside Orleans, the Dauphin still hesitates, and the fate of France hangs by the thinnest of threads, waiting for an unexpected hand to seize it. In the spring of 1429, a strange procession arrives at the court of the Dauphin in Chinon. Among armored knights and weary messengers walks a peasant girl of 19 years, her hair cut short, her bearing strangely unshaken in the presence of nobles. She calls herself Joan, from the village of Domremy. She claims to hear the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, and she insists, with a conviction that terrifies and inspires, that she has been sent by God to save France. The Dauphin's counselors scoff. France has no shortage of visionaries and madmen, but Jeanne is different. She demands an audience with the Dauphin himself, and when she is finally brought before him, legend says she picks him out instantly from among a crowd of courtiers, though he is disguised in plain clothing. She kneels, calling him the rightful heir of France, and promises she will see him crowned at Reims. To a man plagued by doubt, her words strike like thunder. Skeptics demand a test. Learned theologians interrogate her for weeks, probing for heresy, searching for contradictions. Yet she answers with simplicity and unwavering faith. When soldiers escort her to Orleans, she dons white armor, carrying a banner embroidered with lilies and the names of Christ and Mary. Her presence alone transforms despair into hope. Veterans who once muttered of defeat now speak of divine favor. The relief of Orleans becomes her crucible. English forts ring the city, bristling with archers and cannon. French commanders debate endlessly, fearful of rash attacks. But Jeanne's arrival shatters hesitation. She urges immediate assault, proclaiming that God has granted victory if they act boldly. Against all military convention, she rides at the front of the charge. When she is struck by an arrow, she pulls it out and returns to the fight, refusing to yield. The sight electrifies the French troops. They storm the English redoubts with a fury unseen in years. Within days, the siege is broken. News spreads like wildfire. The Maid of Orleans, as she is now called, has accomplished what seasoned generals could not. To the French people, she is not merely a commander, but a living miracle. To the English, she is a sorceress, a witch conjuring unnatural fortune. Either way, she has changed the psychology of the war. In the months that follow, Jeanne's influence grows. She urges the Dauphin to march north through enemy territory toward Reims, the ancient coronation site of French kings. It is an audacious plan. Reims lies deep behind English and Burgundian lines, but one by one, towns open their gates to her. Resistance crumbles before the tidal wave of belief. In July 1429, Charles kneels at Reims, anointed with holy oil, crowned as Charles VII of France. Jeanne stands beside him, her banner raised. At last, the kingdom has a crowned king. At last, the Dauphin is no longer a shadow prince. Yet triumph brings new dangers. Jeanne is adored by the people, but distrusted by the court. Powerful nobles bristle at her authority. Scholars whisper about her voices. Even Charles himself begins to fear her growing fame. Still, she fights on. In 1430, she leads a defense at Compiègne. But this time, fortune turns. Surrounded, unhorsed, she is captured by Burgundian forces. Instead of ransoming her, they sell her to the English, who thirst for vengeance. To destroy her is to destroy the symbol of French resistance. Dragged to Rouen, she faces trial not as a soldier, but as a heretic. For months she resists, standing firm against learned bishops and hostile inquisitors. Her greatest crime, they say, is not witchcraft, but defiance. The defiance of a peasant girl who dared to command men and challenge kings. In May 1431, they condemn her. The sentence is death by fire. Bound to the stake, she prays as flames consume her. History records that her ashes were cast into the Seine, her voice silenced forever. But here, at this very moment, stands the great fracture in time. For centuries, her death has been seen as inevitable, as the tragic end of a saint. Yet one cannot help but wonder, what if her fate had been different? What if the Burgundians had faltered, or Charles had ransomed her, or fate itself had turned aside the flames? What if Joan of Arc had lived? Imagine Rouen, May 1431. The crowd gathers in the marketplace. The stake rises above their heads, and Joan is led forward by English guards. She prays softly, chains biting into her wrists. History tells us the torch was lowered, the fire rose, and she perished in smoke and flame. But in this alternate world, the story changes. Perhaps a daring band of loyalists smuggles her out under cover of night. Perhaps Charles VII finally summons the courage to pay her ransom. Or perhaps the Burgundians, sensing the shifting winds of fortune, refuse to deliver her at all. Whatever the path, Joan does not burn. She lives. Her survival denies the English their greatest weapon, propaganda. In our history, they paraded her death as proof that she was a heretic, a false prophet consumed by divine judgment. But in this world, their plan collapses. Without the spectacle of her execution, they cannot shatter her legend. Instead, her very survival becomes living testimony to divine favor. If God wished her destroyed, why then did the flames never touch her? Pilgrims whisper of miracles, and soldiers speak her name with awe. Alive and unbroken, Joan returns not as martyr, but as prophet triumphant. When she appears once more at Charles's side, clad in white armor and carrying her banner, France trembles with belief. The king, who once wavered in doubt, finds himself lifted by her presence. The court, though uneasy, cannot openly oppose her, for the people hail her as God's chosen. Charles VII becomes more than a hesitant monarch. With Joan at his shoulder, he is transformed into a king of destiny. The war itself shifts dramatically. Orleans was the spark, Reims the flame, but now the fire spreads unchecked. Joan's very existence turns the conflict into something more than dynastic struggle. It becomes a holy war, a crusade to expel the invader and restore France to God's favor. The peasants, long weary of noble squabbles, rally behind her. They fight not for lords or taxes, but for faith and salvation. Every fortress she approaches is shaken by fear. Every town she enters erupts in celebration. The Burgundians, once firm allies of the English, find themselves wavering. In real history, it took years of diplomacy and shifting fortunes to bring them back into Charles's camp. But here, the process accelerates. Joan's charisma is a magnet, drawing even hardened enemies toward reconciliation. When faced with the choice between a collapsing English alliance or a resurgent France led by a living saint, pragmatism wins. The Burgundians reach out earlier, and the balance of power tilts swiftly toward Charles. For the English, the effect is catastrophic. Their hold on northern France begins to falter. Garrisons, once confident, grow restless. Soldiers mutter that God fights against them. Nobles across Europe hesitate to lend them support, fearful of opposing what seems to be a divinely guided army. Every defeat they suffer feeds the legend. Every retreat confirms the sense that England's fortune has turned. And for Joan herself, survival transforms her into something more complex than either martyr or saint. She is no longer a fleeting figure struck down in youth, but a living force in politics and war. The court cannot simply canonize her and move on. They must contend with her presence, her visions, her unyielding certainty. She becomes both inspiration and challenge, lifting France upward even as she threatens to overshadow its king. Thus, the course of the 100 Years' War bends toward a different horizon. Victories that historically came piecemeal and delayed now arrive faster, carried on the tide of faith and fire. The French monarchy begins to consolidate earlier, while the English grip weakens decades before its time. Europe itself senses the shift. Diplomats, merchants, and princes watch in awe as the Maid of Orleans strides once more across the stage of history, not consumed by fire, but blazing with it. The question now is not whether France will survive, but what kind of France will emerge under Joan's guiding hand. Will she be remembered as merely a general, or something far more enduring, a prophet whose voice shapes the destiny of kingdoms? The summer sun glares down on the Loire Valley. Drums thunder, banners ripple, and the French host assembles in numbers not seen for years. At its center rides Joan, her armor gleaming, her banner held high. She is no longer the miraculous girl of Orléans, but the commander of armies, the living proof that France has been touched by divine favor. Her very presence steals men's hearts. Veterans who once slunk from battle now surge forward, eager to fight beneath her gaze. The English fortresses that choke the Loire are her first targets. In our history, their capture was slow and uncertain, but with Joan alive, the campaign becomes a lightning storm. She urges bold assaults where others hesitate, striking before the enemy can reinforce. At Jargeau, the French hammer the walls with cannon fire and rush the breach. Joan, wounded by stone fragments, rises again, calling for the charge. The defenders falter, and the fortress falls within days. At Meung, the garrison surrenders without a fight, unnerved by tales of her survival from the stake. By the time the French reach Beaugency, English morale has collapsed. Soldiers flee rather than face the maid who refuses to die. News of these victories spreads like wildfire. To the French peasants, it is a sign of salvation. To the English, a curse. Superstitious men whisper that she cannot be killed, that God himself shields her. Some refuse to march against her, deserting before the battle begins. The aura of invincibility that once cloaked the English longbowmen after Agincourt now belongs to Joan of Arc. The climactic clash comes at Patay. Historically, this was a decisive French victory, but now it is more than that. It is annihilation. The English, accustomed to preparing defensive lines bristling with stakes, are caught before they can dig in. French cavalry, urged forward by Joan's fearless commands, crash through their ranks. Arrows darken the sky, but the charge does not break. The longbowmen, so deadly on other fields, are trampled beneath hooves and steel. Captains are cut down, companies scattered. It is not merely a defeat. It is the shattering of English prestige. The aftermath is transformative. The French army, once fractured and demoralized, becomes a juggernaut. Every victory strengthens Charles VII's throne. Towns that once wavered in loyalty now declare for him openly. Even noble houses, wary of Joan's divine reputation, rally to her cause. The Burgundians, watching the tide turn, begin to reconsider their alliance with England. Their calculations shift. Better to reconcile with Charles than risk being crushed alongside his enemies. In Paris, English officials scramble to hold the city. They tighten their grip, impose harsher taxes, and spread vicious rumors branding Joan a witch. But the people are restless. They have heard of Orléans, of Reims, of Patay. They murmur that God has chosen France, and that soon the Maid will march to free the capital itself. Diplomats across Europe take notice. In the courts of Aragon, Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire, envoys report on the astonishing rise of this peasant girl who bends kings and armies to her will. Some are inspired, others are horrified. If such a figure can upend the might of England, what might she do to the delicate balance of Christendom? But for Joan, these victories are not about politics or diplomacy. She sees them as divine command fulfilled. Each battle is a step closer to the liberation of France. Each fortress captured is proof that her visions are true. And with every triumph, she presses harder, unwilling to pause, unwilling to give the enemy a moment's breath. The 100 Years' War, once thought destined to grind on for decades, begins to collapse and fast forward. Joan's survival has turned a war of attrition into a war of momentum. The English, once predators, are now prey. The Burgundians, once allies of power, are now desperate to avoid ruin. And France, long beaten down, surges to its feet with a roar. Yet this new tide brings new questions. With Joan alive and victories multiplying, how far will she go? Will she stop at driving the English into the sea, or will her visions demand more? Will the crown of France remain in Charles's hands, or will the maid's shadow grow too large even for a king to contain? The coronation at Reims should have been the pinnacle of Charles VII's reign, a moment of triumph, sanctified by holy oil, affirming his legitimacy before God and man. Yet in this altered history, it is not the king who commands the people's devotion, but the woman standing at his side. Joan, clad in her white armor, banner lifted high, is the true symbol of France's rebirth. The crowd does not chant for Charles alone. They chant for the maid who made it possible. For Charles, this is both a blessing and a burden. On the one hand, her presence cements his authority. Without Joan, the throne might still be contested, the loyalty of towns and nobles uncertain. With her, his kingship is no longer a matter of politics, but of providence. To oppose him is to oppose the will of God, as embodied in his miraculous champion. On the other hand, Joan's popularity casts a long shadow. A king who already doubts himself now finds that his subjects believe more in a peasant girl than in their sovereign. The court trembles under this new dynamic. Seasoned nobles, who once scoffed at the Maid of Orleans, now bow reluctantly. They cannot openly defy her, for the people adore her, but they whisper behind closed doors. They fear she will upend the delicate hierarchy of nobility, where birth, lineage, and wealth have always determined status. Joan ignores such customs. She commands captains, scolds dukes, and speaks to the king as if she were his equal. To the entrenched aristocracy, she is both a miracle and a menace. Yet Joan's visions do not stop at military victory. In this alternate path, she becomes more than a battlefield commander. She urges Charles to reform the crown's authority. Corruption must be punished, she declares. Taxes collected with fairness. Soldiers bound by discipline rather than plunder. Her demands echo across the realm, and the people listen. They see in her not just a saint, but a protector who speaks their tongue and shares their burdens. For centuries, kings had claimed divine right. Now, for the first time, the divine seems to speak back. Charles finds himself cornered. He cannot resist her openly. Her popularity would destroy him. Instead, he allows her influence to reshape his government. The crown, once paralyzed by endless intrigue, begins to act with urgency. Armies are better funded, campaigns better organized. Royal authority expands, not slowly and tentatively, as in real history, but with decisive force. Joan's uncompromising vision drives France towards centralization decades earlier than it would otherwise have come. This transformation is not without danger. The church eyes Joan warily. In our timeline, her trial silenced the uncomfortable questions her life had raised. Here, alive and victorious, she cannot be dismissed so easily. Bishops murmur about her visions, her authority, her place in a world where women are meant to be silent. Some suspect her of challenging not only England, but the very order of Christendom. Yet popular devotion shields her. Pilgrims flock to see her. Crowds kneel in the streets, and rumors of her holiness spread faster than any decree. To condemn her now would risk open revolt. The Burgundians, too, must adapt. Their alliance with England becomes untenable as Joan's victories mount. Pragmatism pushes them back toward reconciliation, though resentment simmers beneath the surface. They bow to Charles, but they know it is Joan's fire that has forged this new unity. And they wonder, in silence, what will become of a kingdom where the crown depends upon the visions of a peasant girl. Through all of this, Joan herself does not waver. To her, these struggles of pride and politics are irrelevant. Her mission is divine. She serves not for titles or estates, but for the salvation of France. Yet the very purity of her cause makes her more dangerous to the world of kings and clerics. Unlike other commanders, she cannot be bribed or bought. Unlike other courtiers, she cannot be swayed by ambition. She listens only to her voices, and her voices demand victory, justice, and obedience to God above all else. Thus, the French monarchy is transformed. What should have been the cautious consolidation of a fragile king becomes the bold advance of a realm infused with zeal. The line between royal authority and divine mission blurs. France is no longer simply fighting to survive. It is fighting to become something greater, forged in faith and fire. But this raises a perilous question. As Joan's star rises ever higher, as the kingdom bends to her will, can even a crowned king contain her? Or will the Maid of Orleans, spared from the flames, burn too brightly for any mortal throne to endure? Across the Channel, the bells of London toll for victory that never comes. Reports from Normandy grow darker with each passing month. Fortresses lost, garrisons broken, soldiers deserting in droves. At first, English commanders dismissed Joan's survival as rumor, but soon the truth cannot be denied. The Maid lives, and with her, France refuses to die. For a generation, England has built its identity upon triumph in France. The victories of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt had been woven into the very fabric of English pride. The longbowman had become a symbol of national invincibility. The Treaty of Troyes had promised not just conquest, but union, binding two crowns into one. Now, all of that unravels. The French peasantry, once docile under English occupation, rise in revolt wherever Joan's name is spoken. The dual monarchy begins to look less like destiny and more like delusion. The regents of young Henry VI struggle to maintain control. Bedford, the great English commander, pleads for reinforcements. Parliament groans beneath the cost of endless war. Taxes rise, merchants grumble, and riots spark in London's streets. How long, people ask, must England bleed for a kingdom that does not want them? And why should God favor them if he shields a peasant girl with miracles? Joan's victories carry not only military, but spiritual weight. Each defeat shakes the faith of English soldiers, who had once believed their cause just and blessed. At Patay, when the longbowmen are swept aside like wheat before the scythe, panic spreads. Chroniclers note that men muttered of sorcery, that the Maid's presence broke courage before swords ever clashed. The invincible reputation that carried them through decades of war is gone, replaced by dread. This crisis ripples back to England itself. Nobles who once profited from war in France now question its value. Ambitious dukes and lords, long rivals for influence, sense opportunity. If France cannot be held, then the spoils must be found at home. In our history, such tensions would boil over into the Wars of the Roses by mid-century. But with Joan alive and English defeat accelerated, that storm breaks earlier, fiercer, and bloodier. The seeds are sown in council chambers where tempers flare. Lancaster and York, once content to vie for scraps of power, now sharpen their ambitions. Soldiers returning from France, disillusioned and unpaid, become pawns in their feuds. England, once united by foreign conquest, now threatens to devour itself. Meanwhile, the propaganda war falters. In reality, Joan's execution served as proof that she was no saint, but a condemned heretic. Her ashes scattered in the Seine were meant to silence her legend forever. But here, no such weapon exists. The English cannot brand her a witch if she still rides at the head of armies, shining and unbroken. Their words turn hollow while her deeds ignite belief. Across Europe, other rulers take note. The Holy Roman Emperor wonders if God has chosen France. The kings of Castile and Aragon weigh their alliances carefully. England finds itself increasingly isolated. The cost of war grows unbearable. Ships carrying supplies across the Channel are harassed, harbors burned, convoys ambushed. The treasury groans under debt. Once England dreamed of ruling Paris. Now it fights desperately to hold Calais. For the common people, the dream of an Anglo-French empire becomes a nightmare. Harvests fail as coin is drained overseas. Families mourn sons who never return. The clergy, once firm in their sermons of righteous conquest, hesitate. How can they preach divine sanction when God so clearly fights for France? Thus, England enters a spiral of decline. Military defeat breeds political fracture. Political fracture breeds civil war. The crown, worn by a child, cannot command unity. Rival factions grow bold, sensing that foreign humiliation has weakened royal authority beyond repair. And in the shadows of Westminster, whispers spread of omens that Joan of Arc is not merely a champion of France, but a herald of England's doom. As the kingdom stumbles toward internal collapse, France rises ever higher. But this raises a chilling question. With England crippled, with Burgundy wavering, and with Joan's influence blazing unchecked, what kind of Europe will emerge from this crucible? France no longer speaks of Joan merely as a warrior. She becomes something greater, something almost unthinkable for her age, a living saint. Pilgrims travel miles to glimpse her as she rides through towns newly liberated. Mothers lift their children to see her banner. Fathers kneel as though before a relic. Chroniclers, once skeptical, now write of visions fulfilled. Every triumph magnifies her legend, until it seems she carries not just the fate of France, but of Christendom itself. The Church finds itself caught in a dilemma. Officially, Joan is still a laywoman, uneducated, without clerical sanction. Yet how can bishops and cardinals condemn her when she has done what no prelate could? Saved a kingdom by God's apparent will? Some whisper that she is a prophet chosen for the end times. Others warn that allowing her influence to grow will set a dangerous precedent, a challenge to the authority of Rome itself. For centuries, the hierarchy of Christendom had been guarded by men. Now a woman from a humble village commands armies and claims divine voices as her guide. To the people, however, these questions matter little. They see only deliverance. In cathedrals, candles are lit in her honor. In marketplaces, her image is painted on walls and banners. Songs are sung that blend her deeds with Scripture, as though she were the new Deborah or Judith of the Old Testament. Even nobles, wary though they are, cannot ignore her. To oppose Joan is to risk rebellion from subjects who believe she carries God's blessing. This living sainthood alters the very structure of society. Women, long confined to the margins of power, begin to look upon her as proof that divine purpose is not bound by gender. In convents, nuns speak of her with awe, wondering if their prayers too might command armies of the faithful. In villages, young girls whisper her name, dreaming of a destiny beyond hearth and field. It is not yet the birth of feminism as we know it, but it plants a seed, an idea that the voice of a woman can change the course of nations. The Burgundian alliance, once the pillar of English power, collapses under the weight of her example. To stand against Joan is to stand against God. Burgundy bends the knee earlier than in real history, sealing the union of France long before the war's end. Trade resumes in the north, merchants reopen their stalls, and the battered economy begins to heal. A kingdom once fractured by civil war now pulses with unity, held together by faith as much as arms. But Joan's presence also stirs unease abroad. The Pope in Rome must consider how to respond to a figure whose authority comes not from the Church, but from personal revelation. Is she a saint in life, a gift from heaven, or a dangerous precedent that could inspire heresies and rival prophets? In the courts of Italy and the Empire, princes fear that her example might embolden their own subjects to claim divine visions. For every believer inspired, a ruler trembles at the loss of control. And still, Joan presses forward. She urges Charles not merely to win battles, but to govern righteously. She chastises corrupt officials, demands fairness in taxation, insists that soldiers cease preying on peasants. Her vision of France is not just of victory, but of justice, a kingdom renewed under God's law. Charles, hesitant though he is, cannot ignore her. To resist her demands would be to risk the wrath of both heaven and his people. France begins to take shape, not as a patchwork of feuding nobles, but as a centralized kingdom, decades ahead of its time. The people see themselves not as subjects of squabbling lords, but as children of a holy mission. The fleur-de-lis becomes more than a royal emblem. It becomes a symbol of salvation, fluttering beside Joan's white banner in every village and town. Yet such devotion carries a cost. For how long can a mortal woman bear the weight of sainthood while still alive? Martyrs are remembered for dying. Joan is remembered for refusing to die. Her continued presence unsettles kings, clerics, and nobles alike. To her followers, she is an untouchable figure. To her rivals, she is a threat that grows with every victory. France is united, England falters, and Europe watches. But the story of Joan of Arc has ceased to be one of war alone. It is now a story of faith, authority, and the dangerous power of a single life that refuses to end where history once demanded. The decades pass, and the survival of Joan of Arc reshapes not only the fate of France, but the trajectory of Europe itself. By the mid-15th century, the Hundred Years' War has effectively collapsed. With Burgundy reconciled earlier, and the English driven back before their strength can recover, the war ends not in 1453, but nearly a generation sooner. The map of Europe stabilizes with a France both united and ascendant, decades ahead of its historical schedule. This stronger, centralized France becomes a dominant force. Charles VII, shielded by Joan's presence, consolidates his crown without the corrosive intrigues that plagued him in our world. His successors inherit a throne far more secure, commanding loyalty from nobles who once would have torn the realm apart. By the dawn of the 16th century, France is poised not as a fragile kingdom still healing from war, but as a confident power ready to project influence across the continent. The ripples extend outward. England, humiliated and expelled, spirals into crisis. The Wars of the Roses erupt earlier and with even greater ferocity. The dream of empire in France is shattered, leaving only Calais as a bitter memory. Without continental wealth and prestige to stabilize the monarchy, England turns inward, consumed by civil war. The Tudor dynasty may still arise, but it inherits a realm diminished, one that lags behind in the great voyages and rivalries to come. The Atlantic Age may dawn with Iberian sails alone, as England struggles to recover its footing. Religion, too, feels Joan's shadow. A living saint who challenged both the English and the hierarchy of the Church leaves an indelible mark on Christendom. When Martin Luther nails his theses to the church door in 1517, he does so in a Europe already transformed by Joan's legacy. Reformers may look to her as proof that divine authority can speak through individuals against corrupt institutions. Or conversely, the Catholic Church, strengthened by her memory, may resist Protestantism more fiercely, wielding Joan's example as evidence that God works through the true faith, not through rebellion. Either way, the Reformation is altered, delayed, accelerated, or twisted into new forms by the precedent she sets. The cultural consequences are equally profound. Joan becomes not only a saint, but a national myth, a living emblem of France's identity. Artists paint her victories, poets sing of her visions, playwrights dramatize her defiance before kings. The Renaissance in France, which historically lagged behind Italy, finds fertile ground in the fervor of her legend. Universities debate her role in theology. Chroniclers elevate her as the embodiment of virtue, and women across Europe see in her a figure who shattered the walls of tradition. In politics, her survival alters the balance of gender and power. Though she never claims a throne, her example lingers. Queens and noblewomen who once confined themselves to courtly roles now invoke Joan to justify greater authority. In convents and abbeys, women speak more boldly of visions, of voices, of their right to guide souls as she did armies. The impact is subtle, but it plants seeds that centuries later will grow into challenges against patriarchy itself. And still the echoes carry further. A France united early and armed with newfound confidence turns its gaze outward. The Italian wars may begin sooner, with French kings intervening aggressively in Milan, Naples, and beyond. The rivalry with the Habsburgs ignites earlier, reshaping the geopolitics of Europe. Spain, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, finds itself confronting not a recovering France, but a formidable adversary already prepared for continental dominance. In this altered world, the great struggles of the 16th century, the clash of Catholic and Protestant, the battles for Italy, the voyages across the seas, unfold upon a different stage. And at the heart of it all lies the memory of a peasant girl who did not die in ruin. Joan of Arc becomes not merely a figure of one war, but the cornerstone of an age. Her survival writes a legacy that stretches far beyond battlefields, reaching into the soul of Europe itself. Yet such a transformation begs one final question. What kind of world emerges when a single woman, spared from fire, bends centuries to her will? The answer lies in the new dawn that rises as the 15th century fades, a dawn cast in the light of a banner still bright with lilies. And so we arrive at the end of our imagined journey, a world where Joan of Arc does not perish in smoke and flame at Rouen, but lives to see her visions fulfilled. In this altered history, France is not a fractured realm limping toward survival, but a kingdom reborn decades ahead of its time. The Dauphin Charles, once hesitant and mocked as the King of Bourges, becomes a monarch transformed, his throne secured by a woman whose faith ignites armies. The Hundred Years' War, rather than dragging on until 1453, collapses early beneath the weight of Joan's relentless victories. The consequences echo outward. England, humiliated and broken, descends into the chaos of civil war. The Wars of the Roses erupt with greater ferocity, reshaping the island long before it can dream of empire. The Tudor dynasty, if it rises at all, does so in a nation weakened, its gaze turned inward rather than across the seas. The English century of naval dominance may never dawn. Instead, France, Spain, and the powers of the Mediterranean shape the destiny of the Atlantic world. But the changes are not only political. Joan's survival alters the soul of Europe. She becomes a saint made flesh, a prophet who speaks with the authority of heaven, yet also a commander who reshapes the very nature of kingship. In our world, martyrs are remembered for dying. Here, she is remembered for refusing to die, and in that defiance, she forces both kings and clerics to reckon with her. The Church, uneasy, cannot deny her influence. Reformers, centuries later, look back to her as proof that individuals can challenge corrupt institutions with divine conviction. Her presence also plants seeds for the future of women in power. She never seizes a crown, never rules in her own name, but her example reverberates. Queens, noblewomen, and even commoners begin to imagine roles beyond the boundaries that hemmed them in for centuries. Her voice, her armor, her banner become more than symbols of France. They become symbols of possibility. Imagine, then, a Renaissance born not only of art and science, but of faith forged in battle. Imagine a Reformation shaped by the memory of a woman who claimed God's voice without priest or pope. Imagine a Europe where England's empire falters, where France strides confidently into the age of discovery, and where Joan's legacy becomes a touchstone for centuries of struggle over faith, gender, and power. Would this be a better world, or a more dangerous one? A world of earlier unity and greater strength for France, but perhaps of harsher resistance to change. A world where faith commands armies, but also where a single visionary bends the arc of history in ways no monarch could predict? These are questions no one can answer with certainty, but they remind us of a truth too often forgotten. History is fragile. It hangs not on vast armies alone, but on single lives, single choices, single flames. Joan of Arc perished in ours, and her death became legend. But in this alternate world, she lives, and the legend becomes something far greater, a living force reshaping centuries. So we ask you, would you want to live in such a world? A world where Joan of Arc's banner flies high, where France rises early, where England falters, and where the balance of Christendom tilts forever toward a different destiny? Or would such a world, forged in unyielding faith and fire, be too perilous for the fragile progress that history later achieved? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the roads not taken, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so that more can join us in exploring the great what-ifs of history. For in imagining the past, we come to understand the present, and in wondering what might have been, we see more clearly what truly was.